Good evening, and welcome to the Illinois PTA Money Matters 101 course. I'm Brian Minsker, the Illinois PTA president, and I'll be your instructor tonight. We will have a survey that is sent out to you at the end of this to fill out. Be sure to take care of that when you get it, and we will send you a certificate probably in a batch after we've gotten everybody's responses in. We're going to get started here, and I want you to make sure you have a question that you want to have answered written down so that you can make sure we get that answered for you tonight. When I teach the PTA 101 course, I always introduce it as the "Oh my God, we're doing everything wrong" course, and reassure PTA people that, you know, we're recommending best practices. That's a little bit different here when we hit to the money matters, because we're talking about financial issues and we're talking about some legal issues that you have to cover in terms of IRS requirements or state requirements. And we will keep track of those for you and mention specifically when it's something you really have to do because the government is requiring it to you to do that. So let's get started. I'm going to start up with talking about the duties of the treasurer. And those duties are spelled out in your bylaws. But basically, when it boils down to it, you are the elected custodian of the PTA's funds, their financial records, and the keeper of the official membership list. And as such, you have a certain responsibility to the PTA because you are the one handling that money. And I know we always think of PTAs as a simple volunteer position, but in reality, your PTA is a 501c3 organization, and you are, in a sense, running a business. So that has legal requirements to it, and it has responsibilities as well. And that's what we're really going to be covering in here to make sure that you're staying on the right side of the law and that your PTA is protected and that you are protected as a treasurer as well. So as I said, PTAs are independent 501c3 organizations. They are private and autonomous. They are not connected to the schools, although they are most often associated with a school. But we do have special education PTAs, we have gifted PTAs, we have community PTAs, many of which are not associated with a specific school, but maybe associated with a school district or a geographic area. When you are a 501c3 organization, what the IRS wants you to do is to work to fill your mission. And PTA's mission is to make every child's potential a reality by engaging and empowering families and communities to advocate for all children. So that is what we should be focused on as PTAs, focused on our mission, not as a fundraiser. What we do with our fundraising is to do the things we do to support our mission. And as part of a 501c3, it's important to support and protect your tax-exempt status. Now, about 6 or 7 years ago, the IRS suddenly made the decision to start requiring every PTA or every nonprofit of any size to file annually with the IRS. Not that they had to pay taxes, but they needed to file and show their existence, basically. And as part of that, they found that the message did not get out to a lot of small nonprofits, many of whom were PTAs or other small booster clubs and things like that. And so if those organizations didn't file for 3 consecutive years with the IRS, they lost their tax-exempt status. And to combat that, the IRS decided they really needed to start putting out some good information on how to comply with the IRS requirements for filing. And so they have put out a lot more information for nonprofits, especially small nonprofits, on how to maintain your tax-exempt status. And they put it out in fairly layman's terms. It's not in the normal IRS speak to a large extent. They have a couple of things that they have done specifically for those nonprofits. They have created a special stayexempt.irs.gov website that is focused solely on maintaining 501c3 status. They have a bunch of helpful videos there, lots of helpful publications, and things that will really help you out as a treasurer if you have questions about maintaining your IRS status beyond what we talk about tonight. And there is one specific publication that the link is there on the slide on publication 557, which is Tax Exempt Status for Your Organization, that covers a lot of the basics for you as a PTA. But the main thing that the IRS wants you to do is to file your tax statement, your 990 form annually, and behave in a manner consistent with your mission as a nonprofit. So we're going to talk a little bit here about numbers that you need to be aware of. And the most important one of those, particularly in terms of the IRS, is your Federal Employer Identification Number. It's called your FEIN sometimes, or your EIN. You may see it referred to as your tax ID number. This is essentially a Social Security number for your PTA as a 501c3 nonprofit. It's a 9-digit number. It's 2 digits, dash, and then 7 digits. So it stands out a little bit from the Social Security number. Your PTA has an FEIN from when they were organized. And if you do not know what it is, if you have last year's tax filing, it will be on there. If your president has registered your officers this year, they got a letter from the state that has their FEIN on it, as well as their national PTA ID number and several other pieces of information for them, including the password for this year's local leader resources on the Illinois PTA website, which has replaced our local unit packet. So if you need it, your president should have it as well. If your president can't find that letter, you can contact the state office or your district or region director, and they can provide it for you as well. What you do not want to do if you can't find it is file for a new one, because when a PTA ends up with 2 FEIN numbers, it's a tangled situation that's kind of difficult to untangle. So your PTA has an FEIN. If you don't know it, contact us and we'll help you find it. All right, we're going to get started on the details of how to do the treasurer's position here by starting with an audit. And the reason why we start talking about the audit first is this is really the first step that you want to take as you're coming in as a treasurer. What that audit does is protects you as a treasurer that you are taking over a clean set of books. And it guarantees that you are not inheriting financial problems from whoever came before you. An audit is also the first step in building the budget, and its purpose is to certify the accuracy of your PTA's financial records. In your bylaws for your PTA, you will find how your audit committee will work. It will tell you how many members there are, how you get those committee members, whether they are elected or selected, who chooses them. Is it the general membership? Is it the all of those details are in there in your bylaws. They will also most likely say that you can use a accountant if you wish to, instead of having an audit committee. All we recommend when you do use an accountant, whether you are required to because of the amount of money you raise in a year, or because you have a parent who is a CPA who has volunteered their services, is to make sure that they're familiar with nonprofit law and requirements. Because as we'll cover later here, there are some issues you have to be aware of. When do you do an audit? Anytime after the end of your fiscal year and before you adopt your budget is the primary time to do your audit. So you do one at least annually. The other times that you want to do your audit is if you've had a change in signatories on your account. If you have a president who moves away and they were a signatory to the checking account, you probably want to do an audit to make sure that there are no financial improprieties. Also, anytime you suspect there is something wrong, sitting down and doing an audit is certainly acceptable to do that. If you have problems with it, you can contact the Illinois PTA and we can come help you do an audit as well. So your audit should be done at least annually. When you do your audit, And there's a sample form in your course book that you were sent. You need to have your name, your PTA, the time frame that's covered, usually your full fiscal year. And for most PTAs, that is July 1st to June 30th. But there are those that have fiscal years that line up other places. And you start with your opening balance. Where were you at the end of your last audit? Your gross receipts are there, are added in. That's the total amount of money that your PTA brought in this year. Total expenditures are then subtracted. That's all the money you spent this year, and that gives you your ending balance. And then you reconcile that with your final bank statement or your after the end of your fiscal year by listing any outstanding checks or outstanding deposits that have not cleared the account yet. And that final figure should line up with your bank statement at the end. And then your audit committee, all three of them, or five, or however many it says in your bylaws, sign off on the audit. Once your audit is completed, it is in your bylaws, it will say when your annual meeting is for your PTA. For most PTAs, that's the first meeting of your school year, and you will adopt your audit there as the first item of business after you get past your minutes from the previous PTA meeting. What do you need for your audit? Your checkbook and check register need to be there. Bank statements, canceled checks, those are usually now images on your bank statements already, as well as deposit slips. Any correspondence you had with the bank for return checks or anything like that. All of your expense and deposit vouchers, which we'll talk about later as well. You also need to have your ledger and receipt book, expense vouchers and invoices for all disbursements, your membership list, financial reports for any other documents that you have relating to PTA's finances, and copies of the secretary's minutes, because it can be helpful if you have a question about what something was, to be able to look back at what you were doing at that PTA meeting and what was approved and what budget line it went against if it wasn't recorded on the expense voucher or something like that. Once you've approved your audit, we'll move on to the next part. But are there any questions on audits or the mere information? You can either unmute yourself or you can type a question in the chat box. All right, not seeing any, we will move on to the budget. So once you've finished your audit, which basically says, here's where we are right now after the end of our last fiscal year, the next step to approve is your budget. And your budget should reflect your goals and purposes of the PTA. The way to create a budget is to discuss with your executive committee or your finance committee or your ways and means committee, whatever your PTA calls it, and whoever is in charge of doing the initial draft of the budget. Discuss what you want to accomplish that year as a PTA. What do you want to do in terms of programs? What do you want to do in terms of activities? What do you want to do in terms of events and educational items? What PTA events do you want to go to? Do you want to go to National PTA Training? Do you want to go to the Illinois PTA Convention? All of those are relevant and acceptable expenses to have in your budget. So anticipate what they might be and put them down first. Once you've figured out your expenses, then figure out what fundraising you need to do to meet those activities that you want to accomplish. When you do your budget, your anticipated income and your anticipated expenditure should be equal. Recognizing, of course, that a budget at the beginning of a fiscal year is only a guess. It's an estimate. But you are allowed to amend your budget later on if you need to move money from various budget lines. If you have a fundraiser that is, very successful and you have extra money, you can rearrange things to do extra items. If you have a fundraiser that doesn't work as well, you can also cut budget line items through amendment if you need to. When you look at your budget, it is categorical expenses broken down by activity. And the final thing to remember about a budget is that adopting the budget and amending the budget are things that the general membership does, just like they are the ones to approve the audit. when you look at what the general membership is required to be allowed to vote on, it is the audit, it is adopting and amending the budget, it is amending the bylaws, it is electing the nominating committee, and it is electing the officers. Those are the things that must be voted on by your general membership. Other than that, your PTA board can handle most of the business of the PTA. So as we said, once you've got your budget and what you want to do, start thinking about your fundraising. PTA funds should be budgeted for purposes that advance your PTA work, and they need to be raised within the context of the mission and purposes of the PTA. That means that having a bar crawl as a PTA fundraiser is probably not a good idea because it doesn't really align with the missions and purposes of the Illinois PTA. You also need to follow the policies of national PTA and government regulations for 501c3 tax-exempt organizations. That means in terms of fundraising, we don't do fundraising generally with alcohol, firearms, or tobacco. Your PTA may have other requirements you want to do. We also, what the IRS wants you to do in terms of your fundraising, one, that it is mission focused in terms of accomplishing what you anticipate doing as a PTA, but also that you are not just raising money for the purposes of raising money, because then you look like a for-profit institution. So when you have your budget that lays out what you're doing and what you want to raise your funds for, that helps satisfy those 501c3 requirements. And while it may be a surprise to your principal, the PTA's purpose is not the fundraising vehicle for the school or the school district. Funds for the PTA are determined by the PTA, and they advance the PTA's work. They can also be used to support local, council, district, and region activities and training, state and national PTA conventions, as we mentioned. You can put in your standing rules what you will cover with this justice, whether it is just the registration fee, if you're going to reimburse some mileage, if you're going to reimburse hotel rooms for attending a state or a national PTA convention, or maybe half of a hotel room to encourage your PTA members to double up. All of those are appropriate ways to use PTA funds and are approved by the IRS. Are there any questions on budgeting? Seeing none. One more thing to remember when we talk about dues and in your budget. If you've taken this course before or you've heard just down through the grapevine is that you don't list your dues as part of your budget. That is incorrect. The IRS corrected this recently, a few years ago. It was always a question as to whether the PTAs, local PTAs, were serving as an agent for the state and national PTAs and shouldn't count the state and national dues as part of their budget or not. The IRS has now determined that you must count those as part of your gross receipts, as part of your reporting for the IRS. So what you do is you include an income line that says state and national dues, which are currently $4.50 per member. And then you'll also have an expense line that also says state and national dues. And those two lines will be matched up exactly. So they are budget neutral in terms of your budget, but both lines need to be there because you need to count those state and national dues as part of your gross receipts. As we mentioned earlier, the treasurer is the official keeper of the membership list, but you work with your membership chair to keep track of who is joining and what your membership list is. And the reason for that is that you are the one to be responsible for paying membership dues. While you are also the keeper of the membership list, your membership chairman should have a copy as well, and your secretary should as well. And the first dues payment is due at the Illinois PTA State Office by October 1st. And as we said, the IRS requires you to count your dues as part of your gross receipts. Are there any questions at this point? You can either unmute yourself and ask or type it in the chat box. Seeing nothing yet, we will move on. All right, we're going to talk about handling money. And this is always the part, this is where PTAs very often get into trouble if they are not following best practices. And in terms of managing money, there are two documents that you need to be aware of as the PTA treasurer. The first is the ledger, and the other is the check register. The check register is just a listing of receipts and expenditures in order of date, just like your check register with your home checkbook. So it is, I got a deposit on this date, or I made a deposit on this date, the next day I wrote this check and this check. It's just in calendar order. What a ledger is records those income and expenses against the appropriate line item of the budget. Now, for a ledger, you can use the big old Bob Cratchit book if you want to use a pencil and paper. I think they still make those. Most PTAs can get by with a spreadsheet. When I was a treasurer, that's what I did. I just did a spreadsheet with my budget line items down the first column and my budgeted amounts for that in the second column. And then every other column after that was just one of the months of the year, because we'll talk about reporting and it is helpful to keep it on a monthly basis, so that I had July, August, September, October, all the way through June, and then a sum total so that I knew how much total had been spent in that line so far for the year, and then a % of the budget line that had been used, which just simply made it easier to keep track of. You can also use full-blown financial accounting software if you wish. Make sure that it is registered to the PTA, though, if you do that. And if you are using electronic records, whether it's accounting software or simple spreadsheet, make sure you back up your financial records regularly. And when I was a treasurer, one of the things I did when I emailed my treasurer's report to the president for the PTA meeting, I emailed a copy of that spreadsheet as well, so that we had a copy off-site. And I kept the backup on a separate little USB drive, so that I had a backup that was not tied to my computer as well. When it comes to managing money, there are three different things that you need to be aware of. First is expense vouchers, the second are deposit vouchers, and the third is counting money. And you have some examples of all of these in the back of your book as well. An expense voucher is what you need to do anytime you write a check. You should not write a check as treasurer without an expense voucher filled out. This is to protect you as the treasurer. Now, I know that I've seen PTAs, been in PTA meetings where the president is signing a bunch of checks for the treasurer. When we talk about it signing two signatures, that's not a great idea, but that expense voucher is there to track your spending. What it will have in the example, if you look at the example, is a list of who the check should be made out to, what the amount the check should be made out to, if there's an address it needs to be mailed to, and importantly for you as a treasurer, what budget line or budget lines it needs to be counted against, and then any receipts or an invoice if you're paying in advance or paying something that's been being billed should be attached to that as well. Most PTAs use an expense voucher that requires a sign-off of the committee chair if it's a budget line item like a family reading night to indicate that it's been approved there. And they may require a second signature by an officer other than the treasurer there as well, approving it. And then you're also going to want to have for your records what check number you wrote to do that and what date you wrote the check. A deposit voucher is actually there, is part of the counting money process. If you look at a sample deposit voucher, it is two halves of a sheet, either vertical or horizontal, depending on what works for you and your PTA, that's duplicated. And the way it works is when you have cash or money being collected, whether it's at a registration event or open house or a carnival or something like that, at the end of the night, you want to have two people count independently and verify the amount of cash received. And they record that on both halves of the deposit voucher. How much they received in cash, how much they received in coins, how much they received in checks. If you do Square or PayPal or something like that, how much you received in credit cards as well could be also there, but as a separate part of not the total amount of cash coming in here that would be deposited. And then after they have filled that out and agree on the amount, the two counters sign off on that deposit voucher on both halves, and then at least one of them takes it to the treasurer. And as treasurer, when you receive that, you count the money again before they walk away, and sign off that you receive an accurate amount of money as well. It sounds like a lot of work, but the reason for this is to protect you as a treasurer and your counters as well of being accused of pocketing any cash or anything like that. It is there to protect you as well as the PTA. When I was a treasurer, there is nothing more scary than the time you're standing around with $5,000 of not your own money. So once you've counted it out and verified the amount, the deposit voucher is then cut in half. One half of that deposit voucher goes with one of the counters. The other half stays with you as treasurer. And when you make the deposit, and you should make that deposit as soon as possible, you get your deposit slip, staple it on the back. For most banks, they will provide you a night deposit envelope if it's after banking hours when you'll be depositing things. And that can work well. Don't leave it sitting in your car. Don't let it out of your sight until you drop it in that night deposit slot. If your PTA has a PTA lockbox that's locked in the office, that can be used sometimes overnight if the people will come in the next day and count the next day because you're ending up late in the evening and people need to get home and put kids to bed. That's acceptable too, but you want to have that money deposited as quickly as possible. Are there any questions on handling funds? Not seeing or hearing any, we'll move on. All right, your PTA has a bank account, most likely, and PTA should be keeping their funds in their own bank account and not run funds in a school or school district account or in a personal account of your treasurer or your president or anything like that. Now, we realize that in some cases, schools have are doing online registration now and are sometimes collecting PTA memberships at the beginning of the year and then writing a check to the PTA. That's okay. But what you don't want to have is PTA funds as a PTA account in the school district accounts. That is commingling of funds. PTAs, as we said, are 501c3s. Schools fall under a different part of the law, and so you really shouldn't be mixing those two types of funds because it will get you in trouble with the IRS. When you are signing checks, we recommend that you have two people sign checks. Now, your bank may not check to make sure that there are two signatures on a check. They may not have a two-signature check requirement, but you can still have two of your signatories on the account sign a check anyway. And part of the reason we recommend two people sign checks is if you have bonding insurance, one of the requirements is that a non-signatory to the account look over the bank statement and sign off on it before it goes to the treasurer for reconciliation. And one of the easy ways as they scan through that bank statement is looking at those images of checks. And any check that only has one signature on it is a red flag check, something that you need to look closer at because it doesn't have those two signatures. Again, this two-signature policy is a best practice, and it's recommended because it helps protect you as a treasurer from being accused of improprieties. You don't want to be signing blank checks. As I said, we know that you see PTA presidents busy signing checks for treasurers and leaving them blank because it's hard to hook up. we recommend that while you should have 2 people signing checks, you can have more than 2 people as signatories on your account, because it sometimes can be difficult to get in touch with one of the other person if it's just 2. So have 3, have 4 if you need to. That is fine. Just remember that you need to have a non-signatory who looks over it if you have bonding insurance. As we said, don't keep cash from PTA events at home for extended periods of time. Deposit them as quickly as possible. And as we said, review your bank statements by a non-signatory. It's okay to have interest-bearing accounts. It's being fiscally responsible. If you are doing a long-range project, such as purchasing playground equipment, which normally should be the responsibility of the school district, but school districts, as they become more strapped for funds, are not doing that, and PTAs often are the ones to do that. But they are a big expense, and your PTA may not be able to raise the funds in a single year. That is okay. If you have in your budget a playground fund line, for example, and you plan to put in $5,000 a year over 5 years as part of that playground fund, it's reflected in your minutes, and it's reflected in your budget. And so when you have that $5,000 raised in that first year, it is okay to put it into a certificate of deposit or a money market account that will draw higher interest rate as well. So it's okay to do that. Also, by having that sort of a budget line there, that also shows the IRS that although your bank account kind of keeps growing there, you're not looking like a for-profit institution, because you've budgeted what you're doing on a long-range project and building up a fund to do that long-range project. So that won't cause an issue for the IRS. I see I have a question here about asking if bonding insurance is mandatory. I have mentioned it a couple times. It is not mandatory. It is bonding insurance is there to reimburse you for theft if you have PTA suffers theft of funds. It is something that's optional. The only insurance we require you to have is a basic liability insurance, or that you sign a waiver saying that you are not going to have insurance, at least through AIM Insurance that we offer through there, and are getting it from somewhere else for that. And we'll talk a little bit about insurance later as well, but bonding insurance is not required. There are a lot of PTAs that do have it. There are a lot who don't. But be sure that you do follow the requirements of bonding insurance, in particular of having a non-signatory look over your bank statement, sign off on it. I believe AIM's bonding insurance really only has 2 major requirements. One is that non-signatory signing off on it, and the second is that you conduct an audit annually, at least, which your PTA should be doing anyway. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about electronic banking here. Electronic banking, there's a lot of different parts of that. We know that our recommendations in the past have been absolutely don't do it. We also recognize that banking is changing, and so we are modifying that and our recommendations on that. Electronic banking can be a lot of different things. Electronic banking could be having, for your bonding insurance, your secretary being the one to log on to the online account to print out a bank statement, because you don't want to pay the bank $5 a month for a paper bank statement, and have them print that out, sign off on it, and pass it on to the treasurer. It could be using a bill paying service through your bank. That's okay as well. But when you do that, you still want to have the signature policy in some fashion. As we mentioned, we want you to have 2 signatures on any check. If you're doing electronic payment through your bank, you can't have signatures physically on those checks. But your expense vouchers can have, if this is an electronic payment, 2 signatories of the account must sign off here, for example. And that would give you a way to have those 2 signatures to approve any of those. That also makes it a bit more challenging for the non-signatory to check on those payments, but they can ask to talk to you as treasurer and see those to confirm that it's okay. It may also involve credit cards or debit cards. We'll talk about those in a little bit as well here in a minute. One thing to remember with electronic banking is it is important to have secure passwords. Anytime you've ever seen a hack and they show the passwords that were hacked, and they are invariably password 1 or 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 or just password or admin. Those are not secure passwords. You want to have a secure password that is difficult and sufficient length, and you also want to change your passwords anytime a signatory on your account changes. That is there to protect you. You don't want somebody who shouldn't have access to your account to still have access through the electronic banking if you're doing that. All right, let's talk about credit cards. And there are two facets to credit cards. First is accepting credit card payments, and the second is using credit cards to spend. Accepting credit card payments is perfectly fine for PTAs to do. Whether you have a Square account, a PayPal account, if you have a PTA store through MemberHub, to accept payments for members or payments for spiritware or tickets to your fall carnival or whatever. Accepting credit card payments in things that if it's through Square or PayPal, you're going to have credit card fees associated with that. Payment makes the fees. So if you are accepting credit card payments through a Square for your membership dues, make sure that your dues are set high enough that you pay for the fees if you have to pay for those, as well as your state and national dues, and have your local dues as well. When it comes to using credit cards and debit cards for purchases, we highly recommend that PTAs do not use them. They are far too often the most abused item when it comes to financial improprieties. Almost every time that Illinois PTA is called in to help a PTA with an audit because they expect there's been some mishandling and misappropriation of funds, there's almost always a debit card involved in the process somewhere. Occasionally it's somebody pocketing cash from events or something like that, but most of the time a debit card, which your bank is going to happily hand you when you open your account, at the center of those problems. So our general recommendation is if your PTA does not have a very specific need to use a debit card or a credit card, shred that debit card right up right away. Now we realize that some PTAs are involved with their school lunch program in some way, whether they are doing the pizza day every week or something like that. And it is really difficult for somebody to go buy 60 pizzas on their personal credit card and then get reimbursed for it, whatever it is. And, you know, if it's one that the parents pay in advance week by week for whether or not their kid is getting the pizza that Friday, so the numbers are going to vary, so it can't be easily write the same check every week either, or set it up to where they just walk in and hand them an already signed check. Your pizza place may not be happy with that. Then yeah, maybe you do need a debit card for that, but you probably ought to make sure that it is very strictly regulated, that the card is used perhaps only for those pizza purchases, for example, so that when you look at your bank statement and it has the debit card, it's only for Ralph's Pizza every Friday. And easily checked. And you have an expense voucher tied to that records the amount that they bought in pizzas every week. And they hand that in to you as treasurer. In those cases, yeah, you can use a debit card, but you really, really want to be circumspect about how you use it. All right, before we get into reporting, are there any questions? Right. I'm not seeing any popping up yet. We will move on. Talking about reporting, there are several different have as a treasurer. And the first level of reporting is reporting to your membership. You should be presenting a treasurer's financial report at each meeting of the PTA, whether it's an executive board meeting or a general membership meeting. It is like a mini audit in terms of how it is reported. What was your opening balance, which would be what your closing balance was from your last treasurer's report? How much money has come in on what budget line items? How much money has gone out, again, on what budget line items? And what's your closing balance? You don't write them down as individual checks in terms of expenses, just by budget line item. And likewise with your income, you can tie it to this fundraiser, this state and national dues, et cetera, in terms of what they are. There's a sample treasurer's report in your course book appendix. And we recommend, as we said earlier, that you do it on a monthly basis. And the reason we suggest you do it on a monthly basis is, one, it aligns with your fiscal year. So you have, your fiscal year starts July 1st or the 1st of some month, most likely. So it's very easy to keep it on a calendar month. Also, most PTAs do not meet on the first day of the month every month. So as a treasurer, that gives you at least a couple days, even if you meet during the first week. Most of the time, it'll give you a couple days to get your treasurer's report done as soon as the previous month ends. So it makes it very easy. If you're doing the spreadsheet approach, where you have your budget line items down the side and you're doing columns for each month, your report is really easy to do because you have those amounts in the columns, so you know exactly what budget line items for money was spent that month, and it can be very simple to get it out very quick. The other reporting you have is to the government. As we said earlier, a federal 990 form is required, and which form it is determined by your PTA's gross receipts. And we're going to talk about the 990 in a little bit more detail in just a minute. Another form you may need to fill out is a Form 1099 miscellaneous. This is only required if your PTA pays an individual $600 or more in a calendar year, not your fiscal year, but a calendar year. The way PTAs very often end up needing to fill out a 1099 is, say they have a chess club after school and they are paying a teacher a certain amount of money every month to run the chess club each time. And if that gets over $600 over the calendar year, you need to submit a 1099 miscellaneous to the IRS and to that individual. What a 1099 is basically like the W-2 you get from your employer, but it's for independent contractors. If you're working with, say, Bubbles the Clown to come in and do a show, though, they are working as a business as Bubble the Clown, and you make your check out to Bubbles the Clown, Inc., or whatever, rather than Sam Smith, who is the character playing Bubbles the Clown, then he is reporting that income as part of his business, Bubbles the Clown, not as Sam Smith. So you wouldn't have to file a 1099 in those cases. If your PTA is incorporated, and we will talk about incorporation a little bit here too, you are required to file an annual report with the Secretary of State here in Illinois, along with a $10 fee to keep your status activated. And the final report that you may have in terms of government reporting is an AG 990 IL, which is filed with the Illinois Attorney General. and it is required for all nonprofit organizations with a net income in excess of $50,000. Now note, this is not gross receipts, which is what we'll talk about when we talk about the 990 form that the IRS requires, but net income, which means that you are bringing in more than $50,000 in a year than you spend. The other time you need to file an AG 990 is if you work with a professional fundraising organization. And we have been talking with the Attorney General's office for many years and have finally gotten a fairly clear statement of what that phrase means, although they will not put it in writing for us. And that is, if you are working with a fundraising group that does all of the fundraising activities with no volunteer help, then you would have to file an AG 990, as would that fundraiser you're working with. So if you're working with a company that does walkathons, for example, and they come in and they provide the online sign-up form, they provide the forms for carrying around your neighborhood to sign up to sponsor in the walkathon, and when walkathon day comes, they provide all the staff that hands out the water bottles and that counts off how much everybody walks and all of that sort of stuff, then that is a professional fundraiser. If you are working with a group that simply provides you with an online sign-up or sponsorship tool, and when it comes walkathon day, it's PTA members out there handing out the water bottles and handing out the t-shirts and counting everybody as they walk, then that would not make you require an AG 990 form. Likewise, if you are doing a direct fundraising through, say, GoFundMe or some other similar company like that, that would not require you to file an AG 990 IL form as well. And the reason why we talked about earlier, when if you have an accountant helping you with your audit or anything like that, is to make sure that they are familiar with Illinois nonprofit law, is that many of them are not aware of those exemptions for the PTAs under the education requirements, and will helpfully file an AG 990 IL for you when they also file your 990 form with the IRS. And the reason you don't want to do that is that once your PTA has filed an AG 990 IL in 1 year, you are required to file the same form the next year, even if you don't meet the requirements, even if you don't work with that fundraising company yet. You have to file it every year after in perpetuity. It's like the Hotel California, you can check in, but you can never leave. So if you don't need to get there, go in there and file an AG 990 IL. Don't start, because you can't stop. All right, when it comes to the IRS 990, there are 3 different IRS 990 forms, and which one you have to file is dependent on how much your gross receipts, that is the total amount of money that your PTA brings in, where that is. If your PTA brings in less than $50,000 in your fiscal year, and that's most PTAs, all you have to fill out is the 990N. It's an electronic form. I believe in the back of your book there is a list of the things you need to file an AG or a IRS 990N form. It is basically who your officers are, a little checkbox that says we brought in less than $50,000 this year, and we are still in existence, a little high, to the IRS. You click it, you file it online through the irs.gov website, and about 10 minutes later, they pop back a little, thank you, we got it, you're good for the next year. Print that out, put it with your records, submit a copy of that to the Illinois PTA as well. The 990EZ form is if your gross receipts are more than $50,000, but less than $200,000 in a fiscal year. Between those two, that covers just about every PTA in Illinois. The 990EZ is a little more complicated than the 990N. It looks a lot more like the and there is a sample of the 990EZ in the back of your book as well, filled out. But it is still possible for you to do still do it as a treasurer. If your gross receipts are greater than or equal to $200,000 in each fiscal year, then you need to fill out the full IRS Form 990, which is a lot more complicated. And if your PTA is bringing in more than $200,000 in the fiscal year, chances are you're already working with an accountant to help you do that. When are your Form 990s due? Well, this is where the IRS is not quite as clear, at least not in terms of plain English, but it's the 15th day of the 5th month after the end of your fiscal year. So if your fiscal year ends June 30th, those 5 months are July, August, September, October, and November, and the 15th day. So November 15th would be the filing deadline for your PTA if your fiscal year ends June 30th. That does not mean you need to wait until then. As soon as receipts are less than $50,000, go and fill out that 990N right away. It takes 10 minutes, and get it done, and it's off your plate. Gross receipts are, you should have all your financial records in order, ready to go. So, don't wait till the last day to do that. As we said, if you fail to file 3 consecutive years in a row, the IRS will revoke your 990 status. Are there any questions on those forms? Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about insurance here. As we said, if you are, or not insurance, incorporation. We're going to talk about incorporation. As we said, if your PTA is incorporated, you need to file with the Secretary of State every year. Now, the reason we recommend that PTAs become incorporated is that it protects your PTA, and protects your officers and directors by turning the PTA into its own entity. Meaning that if something happens and somebody sues the PTA, they can only sue the PTA if you are incorporated. If you are not incorporated, they can also sue the officers and the directors and their personal assets. That's your home, your car, and things like that, your college fund, all of those sorts of things would be open. And any lawyer worth their salt, if there is a problem, is going to sue everybody they can potentially sue. As an example, a few years ago, a PTA was having a blood drive, and somebody had propped a door open with a traffic cone. It's not clear whether it was somebody with the school, somebody from the PTA, just somebody who was at the blood drive walking out and said, well, this will make it easier. But somebody walking out tripped over that traffic cone and was injured. And the lawyer for that person sued the school district, the PTA, the Illinois PTA, and the national PTA. That is, one, why you have liability insurance, but two, that PTA was also incorporated, which meant that they only sued the PTA and the PTA had their insurance, so that the insurance company dealt with the claim and didn't sue the officers in specific in their personal assets. So it provides liability for protection for your PTA members, your officers, and your directors there. If you are incorporated, you can check at the Secretary of State's website, cyberdriveillinois.com. You want to look under certificates of corporation, and you can search, and you may need to search a few different ways. You can search on probably the most unique part of your name of your PTA. If you're an Edison or a Lincoln or a Franklin, Maybe check with including the city on it, because we always recommend for those common PTA names in terms of schools that they have, you know, Lincoln PTA Moline or Edison PTA Champaign to help identify it. If you have an incorporation certificate, or if you have been incorporated in the past, it will show you that you are up to date, or if it's lapsed and how long you've lapsed. And we'll talk about what to do if it's lapsed. If you are not incorporated, the form you need to fill out is the NFP 102 that's available on the Secretary of State's website. It is $50 to register for incorporation the first time. If you pay online, though, there is, I think, a $2.75 processing fee, which is to cover the credit card charge, and a $25 rush processing fee. Not that I think they handle it any faster than if you mailed it in. So it's an extra 50% higher to do it that way. But if you print out the NFP 102 and slap a 50-cent stamp on it and mail it in, it's only $50. When you fill that out, you need to have a registered agent. And a registered agent should be somebody associated with a school who's familiar with the PTA. It could be a teacher who's been there a long time. One of the ones we most commonly recommend is, you know, most schools have a secretary who's been there longer than the carpets. And that's a good person to choose as your registered agent. Talk to them, let them know that you're going to make them that. It just, along with Lincoln PTA, and they can just drop that in the PTA mailbox and you'll take care of paying for it. It's no responsibilities in terms from them, in terms beyond that. If you need to change your registered agent, it's a $5 fee, and there's a form you can contact the Secretary of State's office. They're very helpful with that. When you are incorporated already, as we said, you get that form the next year. It is $10 that you fill back in. You fill in what your 3 officers and 3 board members, pick 3 chairmen, works fine for that. If you are incorporated, you need to amend your bylaws, and that's in Article 1, and there's a sentence at the end that's in parentheses there. It says if you're incorporated, you include this, and it's just this PTA is incorporated under the laws of Illinois, and you just add that to that first article in your bylaws to indicate that you are incorporated. Now, if you check your status and you find out your incorporation has lapsed, don't file a new one. What the Secretary of State's office wants you to do is bring it up. You fill out that annual form, and you can contact them to find out which number it is, and they will pay the $10 for each year you've missed, and you pay a penalty of $3 for each year you've missed. So it's a total of $13 for each year you've missed. If you've only missed a couple, you know, it's 26 bucks. So bring yourself back into compliance with your incorporation. Any questions on incorporation? All right, we'll talk about insurance now. There are several types of insurance. We offer insurance through AIM, in part because they work with, I think it's about 48 states now, maybe even more. And so they're very familiar with PTAs. In terms of that, they're Association Insurance Management. They work with lots and lots of associations. They have tremendous customer service. And their website at aim-companies.com has a lot of resources to help you with your insurance needs as well. If you have questions about it, they're there to answer any of them about what you need to do or how you file or anything like that. In terms of insurance, most common for PTAs are liability, and we require a basic liability insurance, as we said, to protect your PTA from incidents at PTA events. like the blood drive you mentioned. And that's just the basic. Bonding insurance protects from theft of funds. That is not required, though. Your PTA can make the decision of whether you want to do that or not. AIM started offering social media insurance recently. Basically what that does is, in your basic liability policy, there are some limits in terms of social media that are in there. That social media policy lifts those limits off of that. Basically removes those. But AIM can give you a lot more information about the details of that if you have any questions. But they are there to help you, and they do a fantastic job of helping you. When I was with a high school, they did post-prom, and I'm here in Champaign. They were having it on the University of Illinois. University of Illinois asked to be covered under the PTA's insurance that night for the post-prom event. It was very simple to go to AIM's website and take care of that. So they were very helpful, and will answer any question you have about insurance. All right, let's talk about useful tools to have. One is a legal document file. All of those legal documents you need to have. That includes your IRS filings, your insurance papers, your incorporation documents, all of those sorts of things. Having them in one place is helpful. A volunteer hours record is another useful tool. And the way PTAs can use it, I know a lot of schools have volunteers sign in and keep track of volunteer hours now. But your school is not keeping track of the volunteer hours that your PTA is doing at events, or the box top person clipping box top, trimming up box tops and bundling them up at home, or any of that other work. You can keep track of that as well. If you have all your volunteers keeping track of your hours, it's very easy to figure out how many volunteer hours your PTA is providing the school over the course of the full year. And there is an association that estimates the value of the volunteer hour every year. And you can just search on value of volunteer hour, and they are usually the first thing that pops up. And the volunteer hour is worth $20 an hour or more. I believe it's more like $23 an hour right now. So think about that. If your PTA is offering 5,000 hours in a year at $20 an hour, that is $100,000 worth of volunteer service that your PTA is providing to the school. That is a number that your PTA principal, or not your PTA principal, your school principal and your school superintendent and school board ought to know about what your PTA is doing for them. So keeping track of volunteer hours and putting a dollar value on those hours can be helpful as a reminder. And speaking of reminders, reminder list is also useful. When I was a president, I was given a list by the previous president. It was just a list of, here's all the things you have to do as a president. And I am much more organized, although my wife has a less flattering term for it sometimes. And that didn't work for me. So I broke the tasks out monthly and had a binder of what I needed to do. And so I had a checklist for each month of what I needed to do in terms of checking with the treasurer to make sure we were going to be filing our Form 990 on time, checking again to make sure it was going to be filed that month in November, and then in December, double checking to make sure we did file on time the previous month, and all those sorts of things. So a reminder list makes it very easy for you to keep track of what you need to do. It also makes it easy for those who come after you, because you're creating a procedure book when you do that. So as you go through your year as a treasurer, keep track of what you do each time, and when you do it, and what deadlines you have. And when you turn a list by month and you can hand that over to your next treasurer, it makes it a lot easier to recruit those are not having to reinvent the wheel from scratch. They are getting a list of here's what you do and when you have to do it. And for treasurers especially, it's one of the more scary jobs in the PTA and can be hard to get somebody to do it. Having that will help you out. A records retention schedule and got this big box of stuff. Do I have to keep it all? And a records retention schedule, which is a PTA local leader kit, and I believe also in the leadership resources for Illinois PTA on our website, has a records retention schedule of what you need to keep for a year, what you need to keep for 7 years, what you need to keep for 10 years, and what you need to keep forever, so that you don't throw out things that you need to keep. And that should be something that should also be in your legal document file as well. If you are not familiar with the PTA kit at National PTA, it used to be the Back to School kit, and they have a special this year. If you are registering to get access to it, and you do it at pta.org, and it's on the main page there, you can click to sign up. They will send your PTA a do-it-yourself membership plan kit to help your PTA build a membership plan for your PTA that walks you through the process. So it's a really cool tool they did this year that will work for your PTA to help build your membership. So go to there and use it. As we said, your president, when your officers were registered this year through Member Hub, they have gotten a letter. One of the things they got was the password to the leadership resources. Our local unit packet is online, so they can share that password with all their board members, all their officers. There's a file in there just for treasurers full of stuff to help you do your job. So ask your PTA president about getting that password. If they say they haven't gotten it, make sure they've registered all of your officers already. Or contact your district director about getting that taken care of if they have and they haven't gotten it, because we will get you set up with that. There's a lot of great information in there. It used to be the local unit packet, but when it was on CD or on thumb drives, we found that presidents tended to cling to them and not pass the information around. By putting it online and putting it behind a password, all they need to do is share the password, and you can access it from your phone, from your computer, from your laptop, from your iPad, whenever you need it and wherever you need it. So ask you. As we've gone through, we referred to a lot of the things that are in the appendix of your course book that you were emailed. You've got sample expanse. But your PTA has a sales tax exemption number, which is not to be confused with your FEIN number. It is from the Illinois Department of Revenue. It's the same for every PTA in the state. Yes, we know it expires, I believe, in February or April this year or something like that, or next year. We will take care of it as soon as we are allowed to, but I don't believe we can start that process to do it until the first of the year. And once we have that updated, we will be getting the new letter out to all of you as soon as we have it in hand. So don't go and helpfully take care of that with the Illinois Department of Revenue. We've had that happen in the past and essentially had the state office moved to some local PTA school address. But yes, we are aware of when that tax exempt letter expires, and we will be replacing it. There's also some sales tax liability information for certain fundraisers. Basically, if there's a fundraiser that you should require sales tax collection, there are two exempt. You get to exempt 2 of those in your fiscal year. As we said, there's a sample completed 990 easy with schedule, the information you need to fill out the Form 990N, and a little budget exercise on how to balance a budget. Other resources, IllinoisPTA.org. As we said, the leadership resources there. Get the password from your president. There's a whole folder full of stuff for treasurers in there. There are also downloadable versions of sample expense vouchers and deposit vouchers and things like that. PTA.org has the PTA kit at ptakit.org. You have to register to get access to that every year, but it is free. And once you register in there, and your PTA will get a do-it-yourself membership kit this year, which is a really cool tool that they rolled out this summer, and I got a chance to see at National Convention. It is really useful for the PTA. The Secretary of State's resources regarding incorporation at cyberdriveillinois.com. Information on keeping your tax-exempt status at stayexempt.irs.gov. And when you file your 990N electronic postcard, it's at irs.gov. And if you need the 990EZ or the full 990, those are also at irs.gov. Now, when I started out here, I said, write down any questions you want to make sure you've got answered. If, I want you to take a look at that because we've come at the end here. Have we answered that question? If not, type it in, unmute yourself and ask it, and we'll make sure you get it answered. If not, thank you for joining us, and good luck with your year.
I had a question. So you mentioned most PTAs, their fiscal year ends on, was it June 30th? If we're in a PTA that has the fiscal year end at a different time of year, is there a process to change when your fiscal year starts and ends to kind of sync up at a better time like that?
Yes, you can change it if you're one of the old ones. Could you mute so we don't get a mute? All right, thanks. All right, yes, you can change your fiscal year. Go to irs.gov and search change fiscal year. They will have a form for doing that. Basically what you do is you have a short fiscal year 1 year to bring it to where you want to start. And so you have an extra filing in there, but it's very easy to do. It's a fairly simple form to fill out. You can also check through the IRS when your fiscal year is. If you have a question on how to do that, your district or region director can help you with that as well. But most of you have it also listed in your bylaws. At the end of your bylaws, there should be a listing of what your fiscal year is. But remember that what your bylaws say should reflect what the IRS says, because what the IRS says your fiscal year is the fiscal year that you have, not necessarily what's in your bylaws. Because maybe you've changed your bylaw or changed your fiscal year, but when you do that, remember you also need to update that in your bylaws as well. Any other questions? You can type or unmute.
Sure, I'll go again. What are the best practices around dealing with uncashed checks? Our PTA will reimburse teachers for up to a certain dollar amount for school supplies, and I certainly now have a certain number of those just kind of that are pretty old, and wondering if there's a best practice around voiding those out if we can't seem to ever get them taken care of any other way.
First off, I'd suggest talking with the teacher about that and say, hey, we're happy to reimburse, school classroom supplies, but it would help us with our accounting if you could deposit that check. If they've lost the check, then you can talk to the bank about stopping payment on that check and write in a new one for them. There may be a fee with that. When you have fees for things, whether it's return checks, because somebody wrote you a bad check for your PTA, or a check that is, not been cashed in a timely fashion, what you'll want to do is have some standing rules for your PTA on how you handle that. We did a blog post fairly recently about how to handle bad checks. And one of those is a standing rule that says, we are going to charge you what our bank fee is if your check is returned, as well as needing you to make that check good. But having that in your standing rules makes it a policy of your PTA. So basically work with the teachers if they have it. If it's more than a couple of years, it's probably safe to assume that it's just never going to get deposited, and roll it off your account. If you've talked to a teacher about it and they've said, oh yeah, well, I kind of forgot about it and it's a couple years ago and I'm not going to worry about it. So, you know, it's going to depend on how you want to handle it, but you can, you know, work with a teacher, and ones that are really old, just let them slide off so that you don't have to deal with a fee with the bank, because they'll charge you for a fee for anything. Any other questions? A chat point one here. Can the PTA tax exempt number letter be used by parents who are paying for crafts for a classroom or a holiday party, or can the tax exempt letter only be used by the PTA's executive board whose names are on the bank account? It can be used by anyone who is making a purchase on behalf of the PTA. So that means that if it's the PTA who runs the classroom parties, and so any of those crafts or snacks or whatever that are getting purchased for the holiday party are a PTA purchase and are in your budget, then they do not have to be, you know, a member of the executive board to go and do that. They do not have to be you know, an officer or a signatory on the bank account to be the one to do that. That said, you do want to keep a close eye on your tax exempt letters, because there is the potential for abuse out there, and it can cause problems if somebody's using a tax exempt letter to make purchases that are not for PTA business. So you maybe don't hand out a copy of the tax exempt letter to every classroom parent who's purchasing holiday crafts for classroom parties. Or if you hand it out for them to go and do that, you also then collect it when they are done with that as well. Does that clear that up?
If the PTA reimburses someone for things they bought for an event, are we supposed to reimburse them for the full amount, including the sales tax, or only the amount excluding sales tax?
That is something that is up to your PTA. Our recommendation is that you only reimburse the non-sales tax amount, not reimburse sales tax, because we do have that sales tax exemption and you should be using it. We recognize also that there are some businesses that cause issues in terms of accepting that. They may need you to go in advance online and get a card that says you're a tax exempt organization, register it that way, and then take that card up. You know, do what you need to do to work with that business to accept it, but they should accept that in some fashion, whether it is through go to our website and pre-register as a nonprofit, and then we'll take care of it through a card or some other thing like that, or whether you just cart the letter in there over to customer service and say, I've got a tax exempt letter, what do I need to do to make a tax exempt purchase? Or whether it's you just walk through the checkout and hand them the tax exempt letter to type in the number when they're paying. But we have that tax exempt letter, and so our recommendation is that PTAs not reimburse sales tax, but it is up to your PTA to determine whether they want to do that or not. Any other questions? All right, I don't see any other typed questions and not hear anybody else muting. We're going to wrap it up here and stop recording. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening and good luck with your PTA year.